Content warning. This video contains descriptions of stalking, sexual harassment, home invasion, and incarceration. If any of these topics are triggering, please take care watching. 3 terrifying true stories that started behind bars and didn't end there. I still remember the fluorescent glare, the way you remember a siren you can't get out of your head. Not because it was loud, because it was honest. It showed everything: the sweat on my palms, the cheap vinyl of the bench, the orange of the jumpsuit that made me look like someone else. I was 18. I had made a stupid mistake. Story 1. The Weekend in County. The hook is ugly but simple. I shoplifted a phone to show off, got caught, and for 48 hours I learned how dangerous being visible can be. I'd never been in legal trouble before. It wasn't gang drama or some cinematic courtroom fight. It was juvenile stupidity. I needed something to look cool with at a party, and I thought wrong-headedly that taking this one phone from a shelf would be invisible. It wasn't. There was the quiet shame of being led to a small room, my ID taken, my pockets emptied onto a steel tray. The clerk who cuffed me didn't glare. He just looked tired, like the rest of the building did. The fluorescent lights hummed. The booking room smelled like bleach and plastic and old coffee. I remember the sound of tinny voices down the hall, the clack of keys, and the way my heartbeat seemed to try to escape my chest. They put on the jumpsuit in a way that made the whole thing feel final. Slip it over your clothes, not the strings. You are now someone else for now. I was shuffled into holding. The cell was small, a metal bench bolted to the wall, a toilet that wasn't meant for dignity. There were a few others in there, men and young guys, but one of them sat near me and smiled. He called himself Bob. Bob was old enough to be my uncle, or my neighbor, but young enough to look like someone who'd been around the system a long time. At first, he was the nearest thing to friendly in that fluorescent world. He asked my name, offered me his blanket when the vents blew cold air, pointed out which commissary things were worth the money. When you're 18 and ashamed, any kindness feels like a lifeline. I held on to it. Then the small things turned into the long things. A hand on the top bunk, maybe it touched my shoulder, maybe it lingered. Then later, when I turned away, a look that lasted too long. Bob would start questions that weren't questions. Where do you live? What's your mom's name? Who else lives there with you? When you're in a place where your voice is already quieter than usual, questions feel like probes. He learned how to make help sound like a promise and curiosity sound like concern. He learned the shape of boundaries in a place that had no windows. He learned me. I told myself he was just lonely. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's the thing that eats at you afterward, how shame mutes your instincts. Inside detention, everything is smaller. Your choices shrink. You say yes to food you don't want. You nod at jokes you don't like. You keep secrets because arguing feels dangerous. So I smiled back when Bob smiled. I accepted the blanket. I answered the harmless questions. I should have left those answers unspoken. By the time I was released on Monday, the relief of being let go felt like oxygen. Outside, daylight was almost offensive in its normalcy. My parents were waiting. Diana, my mother, the look on her face a mixture of disappointment and practical fury. She took me home and sat me down and said the things parents say that try to wrap a mistake in consequences. We talked about restitution, about apologies, about why I'd done what I did. There was crying, for me and from me, shame like a weight. And then there was the small, sharp, almost ridiculous detail. A friend sent me a screenshot of a message I'd gotten that morning. An Instagram DM from Bob, a selfie, half-smile, the fluorescent glare of a jail cell behind him. "Miss you," it said. The message was short, casual, and wrong in every way. I sat on my mother's couch and felt something cut across me that the arrest hadn't. How had he known my handle? How had he known where to find me on the internet? The answer came too quickly. During booking, I'd been asked for a phone number, and when I'd given it, I'd thought only in terms of contact and processing. I hadn't thought about how that number could become a map. It escalated quietly at first, a car parked down the street for a long time, an unfamiliar pickup idling 2 houses down. Once, when I went to the grocery store alone, I saw headlights pull into the lot and park closer than seemed necessary. The first terrifying, invasive thing was the sound of a knob turning on the front door late at night. My dad had a bat on the porch for a while and laughed too loudly at the idea of protection. The police took the first report but offered a tone that said they had more important things to do. Standard, bureaucratic, tired. It felt like rejection on top of fear. My parents went behind me, called, pushed, and after the 3rd time someone else at the station listened, I finally felt the machinery move. Bob sent messages that were bracingly personal. He referenced a joke from my high school, the name of a teacher I talked about. He sent a selfie from a parking lot and followed it with an emoji that made my stomach drop. At a bar, 3 months later, a place I shouldn't have been, I told myself, another stupid choice. There he was. I noticed him across the room first because his eyes moved like he'd been looking for me before I ever walked in. He was standing against the wall, pretending to talk to someone while watching the entrance. I froze, like the film of ice on a lake. He had the easy confidence of someone who believed he'd already gotten what he wanted, proximity. I didn't have a grand escape. I walked out. My hands were cold, my breath short. Someone I'd known only through a weekend in a county holding had turned my life into a string of alarms. My parents were furious in the way parents get when they feel their child's safety has been compromised. Diana called the station and asked to speak to anyone who would listen. She didn't take the dismissive tone. She showed up at the precinct. She wrote down the messages and handed them to a sergeant. She did the work most of us don't want to do: document, insist, refuse to let it be shrugged off. It culminated in a temporary restraining order. It felt small and huge at once. Small because it was a piece of paper. Huge because it was an official admission that what I feared could be real. The court hearing was impersonal and clinical. The judge didn't dramatically declare him dangerous. He signed an order to stay away, and in his face when the papers were read, I could see a flicker of something like disbelief and annoyance. He left the building with the sort of casual gait a man uses when he believes the paper won't matter. The order gave me some protection until it didn't. Laws can make lines on a map, but they don't stop someone from staring through a window or appearing at the edge of a party. They won't keep you from waking up at 3 in the morning and checking the cameras, the back door, imagining a shadow sliding across the lawn. So the aftermath wasn't a neat moral resolution. It was a slow, chronic thing. Panic at the sound of a car door slamming, a habit of counting locks and lights, a throat tightness when my phone buzzed late. It was the knowledge that a 2-day mistake handed someone a route into my life. The worst part, the part that still catches me, is the way the story taught me about how small choices compound. If I'd not stolen the phone, I never would have been in that holding cell. If I hadn't handed over my contact information in a moment of compliance, my life wouldn't have become searchable. That's the cruel math of it. One wrong move draws a line from the inside to the outside, and someone else can follow it. Looking back, I felt foolish and ashamed in equal measure. But shame is not a shield. The lesson didn't feel like a moral beat so much as a cold fact. Vulnerability can be manufactured from the smallest seams. On a practical level, we did what we could. We changed phone numbers, we checked locks, we installed better lighting around the house. My parents called the local station when they saw unfamiliar cars. I switched my social media to private and scrubbed any public detail I could. I finally blocked Bob, then blocked the new accounts he tried to use. But even after blocking and legal filings, you can't block a memory. It's something that waits behind your forehead. A low-level alarm that turns benign evenings into small operations. Check the front by the window, don't go out alone at night, tell someone where you're going. I don't tell that part to be dramatic. I tell it because it's true. Being behind bars for a weekend put me on someone else's radar. And the enduring fear wasn't just about him. It was about how quickly systems, security, record-keeping, human indifference can create a vulnerability and leave you to close it on your own. If this type of account speaks to you, or you want more real stories like this, consider subscribing. I'll share the others. If the first story is about a stupid choice that allowed someone to find me, the second is about a curiosity that led me into a place that should have been left alone. Different setting, same theme, proximity and access. Story 2. The Abandoned Prison. You've driven by buildings like this, hulking, half-ruined structures that look like they forgot how to be anything other than memory. For months, my friend Laura and I would pass it on our way to nowhere in particular and point at the cracked masonry and say things like, "We should go in sometime." We were 23, hungry for stories, the kind of people who thought a dare could be spun into a good anecdote over beers. We'd go out for the night, and the building would sit there on the edge of town like a peeled tooth, ugly, alluring. The first time we took the side road, it was daylight. From the van, you could see peeling paint and a fenced-off courtyard where weeds had pushed up through the concrete. The name was half gone on a rusted sign. County Detention Center, decommissioned 1998. We laughed at the seriousness of the plaque. The way places like that age is weirdly theatrical. Windows that had been filled with glass were now faces of darkness. It looked like a set built for a film about regret. There's a specific smell to abandoned places if you ever notice it, a mix of damp concrete, old paper, and something metallic under it all. Dust hangs in the light like a million tiny snowflakes. When you shove a door open, you hear the argument between current air and enclosed stillness. Laura and I went in one grey evening because it felt inevitable, like a dare you finally take on because the opportunity is soft and irresponsible, and the only real cost seems to be a story. We weren't thinking about permission. We didn't consider the liability. We were thinking about the thrill. The main hallway was a cathedral of echoes. Cells lined each side like silent mouths. The bars were rusted, and graffiti papered some walls with crude art that had the carelessness of boredom. We moved slowly, flashlight beams cutting arcs across the floor, seeing old sheets, a chair half tucked under a table, a notice board long since weather-beaten to nonsense. The air tasted of old smoke and something like time. We joked, we took photos, we whispered like schoolgirls sneaking into a forbidden place. And because you tell yourself you're in control when you have a flashlight, you keep stepping deeper. That's when something crashed behind us, metal on concrete, a sound that didn't fit the soft rhythm of our visit. We spun. Across a gallery, in a pool of failing daylight, someone stood. He was wearing a shirt and jeans, a baseball cap turned back to front. His face was a shadowed plane. He said he was a security guard. He introduced himself as Mike. Mike's voice at first was ordinary. He had an easy rhythm, like a man used to being believed. He told us we shouldn't be there. He could escort us out, he said, for our safety. Laura and I laughed, a little sheepish, but when someone whose job, apparently, is to keep you from harm offers to do so, you listen. The problem with trusting someone who claims authority is that they can hand you back to the darkness with a prescription. "Follow me," they said, and the dark shifts from scary to guided. A detail that sticks with me. Mike's shoes were too clean for the place. The cap hid the upper part of his face in shadow. He carried a flashlight too, but his was the kind that swept slow and precise. When he asked to see our phones, just to make sure there's no footage of restricted areas, I should have laughed and left. Instead, I let him look. I let him position himself between us and the nearest exit and make a joke about trespassing that cost me safety. He guided us down a stairwell that smelled worse, mildew and old sweat, and the light from our flashlights conspired with the man's steady stride to create a sense of inevitability. At one landing, he pointed out a blocked door and said it used to lead to storage, at another a cellar that had been sealed. He told stories about the place's history in a way that made the walls feel more alive, and us smaller. His hands touched the banister in a possessive way. He walked a little too close. He asked where we lived, what we did for a living, what time we usually got home. He kept mentioning locks. "It's not safe," he said, in a voice that wanted to be comforting. "I'll just lock the door behind us so no one else gets in." The sentence, casual and benign, was the pivot. He made confinement sound like protection. He made the threat look like care. Laura's eyes flashed at me. You could see the calculation, resentment at the violation, the rush of fear, and a quick plan forming. I felt my chest pinch. The stairwell narrowed and the air grew cooler. The beam of Mike's flashlight landed on a door with a heavy metal latch. I felt ridiculous later for the way my mind caught on small things, the way the metal hinge squeaked in a particular rhythm, the way Mike's shadow slid across the scuffed floor, the way his voice lowered when he said, "I'll lock it. Don't worry, you'll be safe." Laura took a breath, one that made her shoulders rise. She said something sharp, and I remember thinking that whatever we'd come looking for, stories, thrills, had been swapped for the immediate animal awareness of being toyed with. We hadn't expected to be prey that night. Trespassing felt impulsive and almost justified by adrenaline. The idea that someone would be waiting inside to exploit that impulsiveness felt like something only movies did. But the building had become a stage, and Mike was the only actor who knew the lines. My hands were a little unsteady on the flashlight, and my laugh sounded thin, even to me. We should have left when we saw him. We didn't. He reached for the latch with one hand. His thumb ran along the metal like he was testing it. Laura grabbed my sleeve. The proximity of the hand to the lock made my throat go dry. The man who claimed to be a guard had the calm, practiced movements of someone used to directing people. "I'll just lock it," he said again, this time closer, as if to reassure us, and as if to whisper the plan into the seam between us and escape. That was where I realized how wrong this was. That was where the scene tightened like a wire. The rest of the building seemed to hold its breath. The beam from my flashlight trembled. Outside, the sky was a smear of low cloud, and it felt far away. He smiled, and the smile was the type that said he enjoyed being in charge of the moment. I tugged at Laura's sleeve. She blinked at me, and for a half-second our eyes met, and a whole language passed between us. "Get out, now!" We both moved toward the nearest cell corridor, not running, because too much would be obvious, but quick enough to snap the rhythm Mike had set. He stepped in front of us. "Hey," he said like a correction. His hand went not to the latch but to the rail. It was a small, possessive move. His voice softened into a low, guiding tone. "You'll be safe," he repeated. "I know this place." He was smiling the smile of someone who expects obedience. My mouth was dry. My brain was viscous with the specific clarity that happens when fear bypasses thought and moves into action. It is odd, the things you notice in moments that might be the last safe decision you make. I noticed his boots weren't prison-issued. I noticed a small stain on the cuff of his jeans, a sliver of something that caught the light. I noticed the way the overhead lights created halos above rusted vents. Those details shouldn't have mattered. What mattered was the fact that a man in a place meant to be devoid of outsiders wanted to lock us into a darker space with no witnesses. I braced as if preparing to push past him. Laura's hand found mine. The building, which had felt like an adventure minutes before, had become a narrowing corridor of possibilities, most of which were bad. And then he said something that made my skin crawl the most. "Don't worry, no one comes here who matters." We both heard the implication. If no one comes who matters, then no one looks for them. If no one looks, then things can happen. If no one cares enough to check the rundown records, if no one files reports, then you're a ghost the second you step inside. The sentence wasn't a threat so much as a confession. This place was a blank space in the world, and blank spaces are easy to take advantage of. I'm stopping here because the moment was a hinge. Everything after this would be the pivot, escape or more. The deck leaned toward panic. The beam of my flashlight brightened in my hand. My heart opened into a slow, dangerous rhythm. Mike took another step. His hand moved again toward the rail. Laura squeezed my fingers, and I felt how small our resistance was, how much we had already given away by walking into a place built for containment. The rest of what happened that night is a story that will unfold. For now, there was only the man who said he would lock the door, the smell of old concrete, and the tight, hollowing certainty that curiosity had led us into a place where curiosity reciprocated with hunger. The rest of what happened that night hinged on a single instinct. When Laura's fingers tightened in mine, it was less a plan than a signal. Move. For a second we both froze, listening for the sound that would tell us whether leaving would be noticed. Footsteps, a cough, the clink of metal. Mike's flashlight paused, the circle of its beam wobbling like a hand that had been interrupted. We stepped. He moved with us, a step ahead, blocking the corridor without seeming to. His voice folded around us again, soft and steady, the voice of someone used to calming people while keeping them exactly where he wanted. "You don't want to get lost back here," he said. "I'll just lock it for you until you get to the van." Lock it. The word had the effect he intended. It turned the exit into an event, an act that required his cooperation. A man who offers to lock a door for you is also a man who can keep the door closed. I felt the old, infantile logic of trust bubble up. Maybe he's really a guard. Maybe he's doing the right thing. I almost believed it until the smell of the stairwell changed, until the beam of his light revealed the way his shoulders turned, not from professional posture, but from the relaxed weight of a person who expected not to be refused. Laura was more decisive than I was. She stepped sideways, shifted her weight, and when Mike reached a hand toward the rail, she pushed him, hard enough that he stumbled back into the banister and swore. It was the first time I ever wished I had chosen a different kind of childhood where I'd learned to push first and worry later. He recovered, laughing as if what had happened was flirtation. He laughed like a man who had been dismissed before and found it amusing. We ran then, not sprinting at first but moving fast enough that the echoes of our shoes announced us. The building swallowed our voices and spat them back in tiny pieces. I half expected shouts behind us, to hear the heavy footfalls of someone chasing, but the only sound that answered was the drip of water somewhere deep in the bowels of the facility. We made it to the front door in a blur of cold air, and the garbage scented outside. We didn't look back until we were in the van with the doors locked and the engine rumbling like a heartbeat. On the drive home, we tried to talk about anything else. We tried to laugh and make the night into the sort of story that starts with, "Remember that time we sneaked into the old place?" But our laughter had the paper-thin quality of something about to tear. I could see Laura fiddling with her phone, already trying to text the people who would approve of the bravado. I could feel the adrenaline fading, and something else, denser and dread-laden, taking its place. The next day we called the police to report what had happened. We were shaking at the station, fumbling to explain that a man claiming to be a security guard had tried to lock us inside. The officer who took the report listened politely, wrote things down, and then told us what officers always tell frightened trespassers. We'd done an illegal thing by entering in the first place, but they would send someone to check. The phrasing made it clear we were both complainant and, in the eyes of the law, offender. It was another reminder. Sometimes the system's protections have a loophole lined with blame. They did check, not because we were dramatic or because our stories were special, but because the call had been logged. An officer walked the perimeter with us a few days later, shone a flashlight into the courtyard, noted the graffiti and the rust. We told him about Mike, about the cap, the clean shoes, the casual confidence. He furrowed his brow and radioed for a records check. The officers came back quieter. "There's no facility employee with that description on our books," one of them said. "No shift was scheduled here, and the building's been decommissioned for years. We'll be putting an extra patrol through. But you two need to understand you could have been hurt." He looked at us with an expression that meant both. You were foolish and you were lucky. When they told us there was no guard, the air in my chest unclenched a fraction and then tightened again. The relief didn't feel like relief so much as the shifting of a weight from one place of fear to another. It confirmed what we'd suspected. Mike had not been an authority figure. He had been a stranger who used the language of authority to bait curiosity. That revelation didn't help with the image of his hand near the latch, the smile that assumed control, the way he had said, "No one comes here who matters." It simply made the building colder and our trespass starker, more stupid seeming. After that night, I stopped joking about dares. I stopped taking the road by the old detention center. Sometimes the blocked windows would seem to be watching me as I drove by, their darkness like a set of eyes that knew my face. Guilt gnawed at me, first for trespassing, then for the way my curiosity had put us in danger. Guilt mixed with gratitude for the very particular kind of luck that had let us get away. It was a complicated, shame-laced relief, the kind that makes you reluctant to tell the full truth because hearing it aloud would make you sound simpler and more careless than you felt. We talked about pressing charges. The officers discouraged it. There was no proof, no identity to back up our story, and the trespass complicated things. In the end, we filed a statement and left it in their hands. I carried the night with me like a bruise. There, tender and slow to fade. For months afterward, I'd wake with the sensation of someone just behind me in a stairwell, a hand on a rail that wasn't mine. Laura and I talked less about being invincible. We both started looking for exits wherever we went, an anxious habit I wouldn't have admitted to at the time. If you think the second story ends inside a ruined building, think again. The common thread is how a place meant for containment became a place that taught me how small openings are exploited. Whether it's a man in a top bunk or a stranger in clean shoes, proximity gives knowledge, and knowledge becomes power in the hands of someone who wants to use it. I thought my next scare would come from a shadow in a stairwell or a car waiting in an empty lot. It didn't. It came from a life I'd chosen because I thought it would make me safer. Story 3. The Guarded Past. Working as a corrections officer felt, at first, like a kind of armor. I told myself that being inside the gates and knowing the movements and routines of a facility would inoculate me against the sort of vulnerability I'd felt as a kid in that orange jumpsuit. I liked the predictability, the roll calls, the controlled entries, the protocols. You take training courses and you learn to read body language, to anticipate the small manipulations that can become big dangers. It made me feel competent in a way the rest of life rarely let me. And then I met Edgar. Edgar was quiet at first. He had a way of listening that made you spill small things. Where you were from, names of relatives, what kept you awake at night, without realizing you'd handed them over. Maybe it was how he tilted his head, or the slow, almost neutral tone he used when he asked a question. Maybe it was that prison teaches people how to extract information in a way that sounds casual. I didn't notice it at first, because I didn't expect to be vulnerable in the place where I worked. That was the mistake I repeated from the earlier stories, trusting environment to equal safety. He learned my name early, and then he learned more. He knew my mother's name, Diana, before I realized I'd mentioned her in passing during a shift conversation about family dinners. He knew my brother Stan's nickname, the one we'd always used at home, because once I'd used it aloud, jokingly. He referenced the town where my nephew lived, an offhand mention I'd made while filling out a form. When he said those things, softly, casually, they sounded less like a man acknowledging small talk and more like someone keeping a list. At first I chalked it up to competence. In prison, information is currency. People pay attention. Edgar's attention just meant he was paying, but his attention felt different. It felt like someone who had catalogued me. Sometimes he would mention something that made my blood slow. "You like coffee in the mornings," he'd say, or "Your mother lives on Elm." He knew details that only a handful of people in my life should have known. He had access to sheets and logs, and I knew institutionally how easy it sometimes was, whether through carelessness or design, for inmates to learn snippets of staff life. He was never overtly threatening. He never raised a hand in anger, never threatened me in front of others. His methods were subtler and therefore more unnerving. He'd smile in a way that suggested he believed he'd already won a small private victory, knowledge without consequence attached yet. I found myself watching who I shared things with, tightening the perimeter of what was mine to give. It's a strange humiliation, being guarded in the place where you patrol. There's a reversal that doesn't feel fair. Edgar was released after a while. That's how many of these stories unfold. The person who taught you your vulnerabilities gets to walk back into the world while you're still paying interest on the fear. I told myself that by then I'd learned what to watch for. I told myself that my training would keep me safe. The truth is simpler and smaller. After years of seeing patterns, I had a new kind of worry instead of invincibility. Months after his release, my phone buzzed at midnight. It was my Ring camera alerting me to motion at the front step of my girlfriend's house. I sat up quickly and watched the live feed with a certainty that my heart would reveal because my fingers didn't want to be wrong. There was a man standing on the porch, holding a covered cooler. He knocked, waited the polite space, and rang the bell again. He looked around like any delivery person might. Then he said it, "Selling meat." The nonsense phrasing made my stomach flip. I watched him on the camera, the porch light casting his face in washed-out tones, and the rain glistening on the cooler. He stood for a moment, looked up at the door as if assessing for a second ring, and then turned and walked away with a slow, almost deliberate stride. It was an odd domestic image, someone selling cold cuts pitched to bewilder the neighborhood at night, but the details followed a pattern I had seen before. The casualness, the pretense of authority, the way he used small talk to feel people out. I watched the clip frame by frame. The man lingered by the mailbox, checking it as if reading a name. He glanced across the street, and for an instant I saw that familiar register in his eyes. Awareness of place, the kind of access that comes from having spent time inside systems where you learn to map people and routines. The hairs on my arms prickled. It was Edgar, or at least someone who fit the cadence and mien I'd learned to associate with him. There was no way to be certain from the grainy footage alone, but the posture, the walk, the tilt of the head, those were markers I knew. After that night, there were other things I started to notice. Late-night rings at my girlfriend's door, light movement caught by cameras on the perimeter, a silhouette on the sidewalk when there should have been no one. Once a neighbor texted a photo of a man, fitting Edgar's description, standing at the end of the block, looking at the houses as if ticking them off on a list. I started sleeping with my phone next to me, thumb on the screen as if a message could be the same kind of balm it had been in the past. I called the local precinct and told them what I'd seen. They advised caution, recommended locking doors, and notifying them if I felt threatened. It was bureaucratic and practical, and also, in a small way, insufficient. What made it worse was the administrative opacity I encountered when I tried to verify Edgar's status. Records sometimes show a release date and a last known address. Other times they show nothing. People fall through the cracks for many reasons: data entry errors, incomplete releases, homelessness. When I asked, I was given vague statements about parole and monitoring, non-committal answers that did not reassure me. The not knowing is its own torment. Knowing someone dangerous is out there, and not knowing whether they have a fixed point to return to, is a strange kind of suspended terror. Then there was the footage that made me feel small and exposed, in a way different from the nights in holding or the stairwell with Mike. One afternoon, my girlfriend watched an old clip back and froze. There, on the camera feed from earlier that morning, a man was walking up her sidewalk and stopping at the same mailbox shown in the late-night clip. He looked directly at the camera, and for a fraction of a second he seemed to smile. It wasn't an overtly menacing grin, just an expression like a person who knew he'd been seen and wasn't worried about it. He turned and walked away. We froze, replaying the segment. The man's face was small in the grainy pixelation, but the smile was unmistakable. We presented the footage to the police. They took a report and entered the details. We did what was recommended, changed our routines, updated locks, asked neighbors to be aware. We avoided walking alone at night. My girlfriend installed additional lighting. My mother kept a list of numbers to call. We felt both prudent and childish, like people performing rituals against the possibility of intrusion, because rituals at least gave the illusion of control. I've replayed that small smile more times than I can count. There are mornings when I wake with the echo of it and the obvious questions that follow. Did he know where my family lived? Had he been watching long before I noticed? Where did he get the names? Those questions have no clean answers. They have only implications. The scariest thing was not knowing whether he had any plan beyond unsettling us. The scariest thing was knowing he knew how to map my life in a way that made me feel unmoored in my own neighborhood. I did go to the station and tell the story about Edgar specifically, about how he'd known family names and how a man resembling him had stood at my girlfriend's door. The officer nodded and promised to check parole records and recent sightings. Sometimes systems respond, sometimes they don't. In my case, I was given one answer that was both small and huge. There was no public stable record of Edgar's address. He had slipped into the gaps the way all the other things I feared had done. Information, movement, anonymity. That lack of closure is the worst part. In the weekend in county, the restraining order offered a thin slab of comfort, a legal line you could point to. In the abandoned prison, the lack of a verifiable Mike left us with shame, but also a clean lesson never to go back. With Edgar, there has been no tidy document to point at, no finality. There is only the constant recalculation of risk, adjust a route, check the cameras, change patterns. My vigilance became permanent, not a phase but a new baseline. Maybe the one small mercy is that Edgar, like many who drift in and out of these institutions, is more likely to be transient than omnipotent. People move, they cycle in and out of systems, they sometimes return to custody for reasons unknown to you. You learn to hope for the systems to work, parole officers doing their jobs, neighbor reports that lead to intervention, without relying on them to soothe your nights. Hope in this context is thin and practical. Maybe he'll get picked up again. Maybe a job will take him to another state. Maybe our vigilance will simply make his life less interesting to him. None of those are guarantees. They're wishes dressed as strategies. I should say something honest about being a corrections officer and feeling vulnerable. There's a shame to it, like admitting you're afraid of a thing you are trained to manage. But the truth is that training teaches you to anticipate patterns, not to remove the human element that makes those patterns mutable. People are unpredictable, systems are fallible, and sometimes the people we'd least expect to be dangerous, neighbors, casual acquaintances, the men who once smiled at you from a metal bench, are the ones who find ways to attach themselves to your life. Aftermath and threads. If you've made it this far through the 3 stories, you've heard the through line: proximity makes pathways. In each case, the arc begins with a small opening, one stupid lift of a phone, a curiosity-driven trespass, an employment that exposed personal details, and ends with an external person exploiting what was given, found, or recorded. The jail cell, the abandoned blocks, the staff desk. These are not the only places where vulnerability exists, but they're places where the bureaucracy of control interacts with human error in particularly hazardous ways. The legal system sometimes responds, sometimes it doesn't. Restraining orders, police reports, patrols, records checks, these are tools that matter, and I'd encourage anyone in similar situations to use them. At the same time, they are not a panacea. They can be a line in the sand, but they don't remove the sense of being watched or the internal habit of checking locks twice. They don't undo the moment you put something into the world that someone else can map. I want to be careful here about one thing. None of these stories are an indictment of every person behind bars or every corrections officer. The point isn't to say that institutions are uniformly dangerous or that everyone who has been inside a cell is a predator. Rather, each story is about how access and knowledge, a phone number, a route through a building, institutional familiarity, can be weaponized by a small number of people. Most people inside those places aren't preying on others, but the ones who do exploit laxity or trust can leave a lasting shadow. There is also a theme of shame that runs through these accounts. I felt shamed by my own mistakes in the first story, guilty for having put myself in a vulnerable spot by stealing. I felt embarrassed and foolish for trespassing in the second. I felt exposed in the third, like a professional who had been surprised by gaps in the very system I trusted. Shame can be paralyzing, but it can also be instructive. In my life, it forced me to change some behaviors and to ask for help when I needed it, something I was reluctant to do at first. After the restraining order, after the police patrols, after changing locks and scrubbing public data, the emotional residue remained. Panic attacks at night, dreams where doors vanish, a baseline readiness that made ordinary evenings feel like operations. Those are the long shadows of these encounters. They're real. They're heavy in ways a piece of paper can't fix. What I learned, and what I hope you take away, isn't a how-to or a moralizing list. It's a set of small, sober facts. First, your choices matter. Stupid, impulsive acts can cascade into consequences you didn't foresee. Second, curiosity can be dangerous. The thrill of breaking a rule for a story can hand you to someone who reads curiosity as opportunity. Third, systems are imperfect. They can both protect and fail to protect you, sometimes in the same breath. And fourth, vulnerability isn't weakness. Acknowledging it is how you start to protect yourself. If any part of what I've told rings true with your life, if you've had someone linger in a way that made you check the locks at night, if someone used information you gave them to find you, if an abandoned place that looked like a dare became something else, please take it seriously. Document, tell people you trust, and contact authorities. I won't pretend the response will always be perfect, but it's better to have records and witnesses than silence and fear. Final note. Content caution. There's a small necessary reminder here. This video began with a content warning for stalking, harassment, and invasion. These topics are heavy and personal. If watching brought up anything for you, please reach out to someone you trust or a professional. You don't have to carry it alone. Thanks for listening to these 3 true stories. If they affected you, if you want to hear more real accounts about the strange ways danger slips into ordinary lives, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be aware. Stay safe, look out for one another, and remember, the things that happen behind bars sometimes follow you into the sunlight.